千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. I would like to extend a warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us. I want to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment, to the here and now, to be fully present and mindfully aware as we all gather together in this sacred Tao process. Chapter 57 has the chapter title, Rule the Kingdom. As I mentioned last time, those two characters can be translated variously. You can say govern the country, govern the kingdom, rule the country. However you translate it, the deeper meaning of ruling the kingdom is to take charge of your life. So this is always the metaphor for ruling the kingdom in the Tao Te Ching. Because as I like to say, you are the sovereign of your own destiny. So last time, we did the sectional analysis as usual. We ended up with 3 sections, as you can see here. And we were able to get to line 13. And just a quick reminder or recap for everyone, I mentioned that this particular chapter follows a yin and yang structure. Lao Tzu starts out in section 1 talking about the proper way to rule the kingdom or govern a country or to run your life. So he spends 3 lines talking about the overall proper approach, the best way, the correct approach. Then he says, well, how do I know this is the right way? Then he goes on to talk about the 2 sides of the coin, like the yin and yang symbol, complementary duality. He began talking about what not to do from line 6 to line 13. That's what we covered last time. And it turns out there are 4 aspects of what not to do. Then from line 14 to the end of the chapter, it's the other side of the coin. The complementary duality, the flip side of that, the yin and yang symbol is what to do. So we got done talking about what not to do. We're going to be going forward today to finish a discussion on what to do. As we were talking about what to avoid, the 4 factors to watch out for in life, there was a key concept that I don't want to miss in doing a recap. You're going to see that Lao Tzu talks about how, well, whenever there are many restrictions in the world, line 6, line 7, the people become more impoverished. This is actually the concept of self-imposed constraints, self-imposed limitations or restrictions. When you map the kingdom in this chapter to the private kingdom of your life, this becomes clear. So when we talk about excessive restrictions imposed by the ruler on the subjects, it can be applied not only at the kingdom level, but also at the individual level. So just think of yourself as the king or queen in your own private kingdom. So previously, we used an illustration to try to make this concept clear, easy to grasp. This is the graphic that we looked at when discussing the kingdom level. The king, if he were to impose more restrictions, more taxations, this will have a couple of detrimental effects. The excessive bureaucratic restrictions will cause people to toil under burdens, unnecessary government functions or operations. Bureaucratic red tape, yes, bureaucratic red tape existed in ancient China. It's not a modern thing. Human beings have a long history of bureaucracy. And two, if the king were to impose additional taxes, heavier taxes, the taxation would be something that caused the people to not have a whole lot left once they've been taxed. They don't get to have a whole lot saved up so that they can become prosperous. So these negative consequences are just a way to talk about what can happen when you impose overly restrictive limitations on yourself, sometimes even without realizing that's what you're doing. So then we transition with the same graphic, but different content, no longer at the kingdom level, but at the individual level. The situation is similar, but just at the smaller personal scale. So what happens when you impose a lot of restrictions on yourself without even realizing it? Well, you miss out on life. You may not even try to do something because of that self-imposed limit. And if you never try, you never fail, which is comforting, but you also never succeed. And previously, I quoted Wayne Gretzky, the hockey great, that you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So in this fashion, life is impoverished. And if you hold on to dogmatic beliefs that limit you, restrain you, when they no longer serve you, your view of the world remains narrow. You never actually get to expand your horizons. And that causes your life to be poor as well. So you never push the envelope. You never go beyond what you thought you could do. Your views remain provincial. And overall, life is not as great as it could be. Now, all of this appears to be at the mental level. These are beliefs and thoughts that we impose on ourselves. But it all goes back to the spiritual dimension. The way that we can free ourselves is to first dig deep to the level of the spiritual or the soul and have that key realization that, wait a minute, I thought these restrictions were externally imposed by external factors upon me. Perhaps it is the economy, it's really bad, and that's imposing a limit on me. Perhaps it is my boss who is a jerk. He is imposing limits on me. Well, at the level of soul searching, spirituality, you begin to realize that at the most fundamental level, nothing can really restrict you. Whatever restrictions you impose, you've done it to yourself. So we used a story to talk about this idea last time. The name of the story was The Dharma of Spiritual Release. So this was about Dao Xin. Dao Xin was a practitioner of Zen Buddhism from a young age, and he met the third patriarch of the Zen Buddhism tradition as a 14-year-old, roughly about 7 years after he began practicing and studying Zen Buddhism. So his first request was that he was seeking the Dharma of spiritual release. So as you may recall from last time, the patriarch immediately pointed out that, listen, there is nobody tying you down. There's nothing to tie you down except for what you have conjured up in your mind. Because at some level, we have accepted the imposition of these restrictions. These are things that we have the power to undo. And upon that realization, Dao Xin became enlightened, and he would eventually become the fourth patriarch of Zen Buddhism, taken over from his master, the third patriarch. So the illustration that you see in the lower right-hand corner, this was as close as they could get to a photograph. It's a portrait from ancient times. So this is a good lesson for us. It's a good reminder that we don't know if we don't think about it, we don't realize it, if we don't contemplate the possibility that, hey, the biggest enemy that we have is actually ourselves. And we actually possess enormous power to break free. We can simply dismiss the constraints. We can revoke the blind acceptance of those limitations. And it's a lucky thing that we get to study these stories and these teachings in modern times. These are the ideas that have been worked out, refined throughout history by sages, by wise practitioners who came before us. So in effect, we're standing on the shoulder of giants. We can look further and see more than if we started out from scratch on our own. So anyhow, to continue with our recap, we ended with this graphic, this idea. So this is a summary of all the things to avoid, all the negative effects of all the what not to do from Lao Tzu. As we talked about last time, Lao Tzu asked himself the question, how do I know this is right? How do I know this is correct? And then he says, well, with the following. For the king, too many restrictions leads to people becoming impoverished. And for the kingdom, too many weapons among people's possession leads to chaos, of course. And too many clever tricks that people are forced to resort to will result in strange problems, what he calls strange things. And then too many laws, too many rules will actually give rise to criminals, more criminals, what not to do. And all of these are readily applied to the personal level. These are the things that we need to avoid and watch out for. So this is not just something that's relevant to the ancient rulers. It's very relevant. All of these are very relevant to us. So we should not have those self-imposed restrictions, as we just recapped. And when it comes to weapons, the idea is that to pack weapons in this case is metaphorical. It means that we're ready to fight, for contention, ready to argue. The Tao cultivator, rather than going into the world prepared to fight, would be instead very much more interested in promoting peace and harmony. So rather than to bring weapons, which means critical remarks, criticisms, complaints, negativity directed at other people. Rather than to do that, we bring peace and harmony for harmonious personal interactions. That would be another thing to watch out for. None of those personal weapons, verbal weapons, that we should bring with us. And then clever tricks. This manifests at the personal level as shortcuts. Now, shortcuts are different from creativity applied to work. One can be intelligent and creative in reducing the amount of unnecessary work. Clever tricks in this case would be clever ways in finding shortcuts to avoid the work altogether. And that's going to result in strange problems. And lastly, rules and restrictions. Criminals in this case is a reference to ourselves as well, that if we have these complex rules, a lot of complexity in life, we become like thieves and robbers, stealing from ourselves the peace of mind, the happiness that we could otherwise enjoy. So this is it for the recap, what we talked about before, some big ideas. Now we're ready to continue on to go forward in our discussion. Now we're in the last section, section 3, in line 14, starting with line 14. The middle two characters, 圣人, this is translated as sage. So if you look back and forth between the ancient Chinese and the modern English, you will be able to tell that 故, the first character there, is translated as therefore. It can also be translated as thus, so, so. They would all mean similar things. And then 圣人, translated as sage. And then the last character, says. Now, 圣人, I want to make sure, because we have a lot of people who are listening for the first time, not familiar with the stuff that we have talked about before. 圣人, the sage, is an important concept. Here's the pinyin, so you can sound it out yourself if you want to. 圣人. The second character, 人, meaning person, is trickier to sound out correctly in Mandarin. But let's talk about the two characters and what they mean. The first character means divine or sacred, and the second character is person. What is a divine person? Well, it's actually not literally a divine person. Rather, it means someone whose wisdom approaches the divine, like a divinely wise person. And we translate it as sage because that's exactly what sage means. So note that in this context, Lao Tzu is not referring to himself. He's not saying, me, the sage, says the following. He's saying, sage in reference to the people from the past to him, long time ago, from his perspective. These are the previous generations of sages that have taught the Tao, and he's learning from them. So that's the people that he was pointing to. And let me also point out, divine person, probably the worst translation for that would be holy man. If you think about, just in English, the difference in context and meaning and nuance between sage and holy man is pretty wide. There's a big difference between the two. Holy man doesn't really convey 圣人because there's no religious context in 圣人. It's not a priest. It's not a medicine man like a holy man. the shaman in a tribe. It's not that. And yet another way to translate it, to render it incorrectly, that has become fashionable in some circles, is the expression evolved individual. So at least the person who came up with evolved individual as an expression realized that Shenren has no religious context, and therefore evolved individual would be better. It is still wrong though. Why is it wrong? Because evolved individual is in the context of spiritual evolution. There is no specific mention of spiritual evolution in the Tao Te Ching. There's no clear link in the Tao Te Ching between spiritual evolution and the divine. So when you talk about evolved individual, it's really a modern invention by an author who is trying to inject some personal opinions. That's always a no-no when you want to translate as accurately as possible. So let's move on. Line 15. Line 15 says, I take unattached action and the people transform themselves. Let's take a look at that. Unattached action, what does that mean in the context of a ruler? Well, actions with attachments lead to complexity, more rules, more restrictions. The wise ruler would not try to impose complex rules in an attempt to make the people behave. They avoid complex rules. What do they do instead? Well, what they would do if they are truly wise is to establish basic principles and also set themselves up as good examples in that they themselves are not exempt from the basic principles. And what that means, when we talk about basic principles, this implies simple yet effective systems. One that will guide people on the right path and allow the people to transform themselves. And there are numerous examples that we can talk about. So as some possibilities to consider, if you think about proportional incentives, if you think about positive reinforcement, when people do something right, you provide a reward, you provide recognition so that you can reinforce the positive behavior. And this applies at the personal level as well. The result of this, according to this line, is that the people will transform themselves. And the idea is that the people emulate the good examples set by the wise ruler, and they, in seeking that emulation to do the same thing, they gradually transform themselves. What about us? Well, same thing. If we are the wise rulers of our lives, then we would also want to reduce complexity. We would also want to set up a simple framework and then let the consistent practice take effect so that life becomes transformed seemingly all by itself. So we talked about incentives, we talked about positive reinforcement. It turns out in psychology, when you want to create some kind of change in the way you approach life, one very effective way to do it, this is confirmed by many psychology experiments, is that if we set up a personal reward system, that is, you set up a plan, you set up objectives within the plan, then you set up a personal reward system that if you're able to get to XYZ, you reward yourself appropriately with ABC. That turns out to be the most effective way imaginable according to numerous studies. You can, for instance, overcome procrastination by doing exactly that. Set up a plan, set up goals, and personal reward system to reward yourself for accomplishing the different steps. So bottom line, the wise person will basically rule his or her life by reducing complexity, distilling everything down to the essence. And when you do this correctly, you can expect things will change by themselves. And when we say things change by themselves, I mean the different aspects of life. They all get better and better. And this is what people transforming themselves means when you map it to your personal kingdom. Let's continue on. Line 16, just a few lines from the end of the chapter. It says, I prefer quiet, and the people write themselves. So what I've done here is that I've singled out one character, the second character in the line. This character usually is hao, meaning good or well. Hao, like when you say ni hao. So literally it's you good, you well. And ni hao is the Chinese, the Mandarin way of greeting. It's like, how are you? So the meaning is good, well, but that's not what the meaning is in this context. Here, it's not used as an adjective. Good is an adjective. Here, it's actually a verb. In traditional Chinese, when you say it as a verb, it's not hao, it's hao. So the sound is the same, but the pitch is different. Simplified Chinese does away with the different pitches, but this is the correct way, hao. And it means prefer or like. So it's a straightforward translation. The first character in line 16 is I. Second character, like or prefer. Third character, quiet. So it can be, I like quiet. I prefer quiet. Let's bring that in. So the sages, remember, this is what the sage says. The sages all say that I prefer quiet. They are unanimous in that regard. There is a classic specifically devoted to that concept, clarity and tranquility. And why is it so important to have quiet in the context of clarity and tranquility? Because that is the one thing that will give you the strongest connection possible to the Tao. Hence, every advanced cultivator has a personal practice of quiet time alone, where they can contemplate and reflect on life. So let's dig into the meaning of this line. If you prefer quiet, the people write themselves. What does that mean? Well, preferring quiet in this context has two sides. One context is when you say I prefer quiet, you're talking about you act rather than talk. You want deeds rather than words. So wise rulers talk less and do more. Unwise rulers talk more and do less. I think when I put it that way, it's easier to see. So the wise rulers, they demonstrate what they want to accomplish through actions. They don't bother lecturing people. Unwise rulers will lecture all day long, but they can't do what they talk about. When I lay it out that way, it becomes easier to see the difference. In life, we also see people like that. We see plenty of people who lecture all day long, but have no ability to follow through, and they themselves cannot do what they want other people to do. So when you see the opposite, when you see someone who is able to walk the talk and not just talk, then you're motivated to also straighten yourself out. Hence, the wise rulers demonstrate through actions, not lectures, and this is what motivates people to straighten out themselves. And another aspect of it is that wise cultivators follow the examples set by the wise rulers of ancient times. So if we consider ourselves to be wise, we would also be focusing on actions and not words. We would be executing on a plan. We would plan things out and then do what the plan tells us to do, rather than to spend a whole lot of time talking about the plan, telling everybody what we're planning. Okay, and then so that's the meaning behind preferring quiet and allowing the people to write themselves. Next line says, I do not interfere, no interference, and the people enrich themselves. So let's talk about that. So the wise ruler refrained from meddling in people's lives. This is an old concept. The old concept is that a kingdom or an empire, it's like a living thing. It has a natural vitality. Because of that, you don't need to do a whole lot to make it healthy. You really only have to remove obstacles, the things that are harmful to this animal called kingdom or empire. When you remove the things that are bad for the kingdom or empire, the natural vitality kicks in and it's going to prosper. It's going to flourish. So here we go. Here's the bullet. Remove obstacles to let a kingdom's natural vitality flourish. And you can see where this is going. You can see how this applies to life. Apply to life, it means you would also remove elements that are not very helpful to you. So the idea is that you don't need more techniques. You don't need to buy things. That would be addition. That would be adding more. Rather than to add things, the Tao is about subtracting, reducing, which means identify the things that you are doing that's excessive, that's not giving you good results. Identify all the things that you don't actually need in life, let them go. Reduce, subtract. The more you do that, the more your own natural vitality, or I should say, the natural vitality of your life, your destiny, it will reassert itself. It will naturally prosper. You are removing the things that hold it back. So yeah, your destiny has a natural vitality also. This is an old concept. And if you would like additional references to this, you'll find a story in the Tao of Happiness called Hongdi and the Boy. That's where Hongdi, the ancient yellow emperor, learns from a boy who compares ruling the empire to taking care of a horse. You're going to see exactly this concept here being applied to that and being applied to the realization of the yellow emperor, that who would then go on to do that exact same thing, and indeed his empire flourished and prospered. So remember, rather than to add things to your life, subtract, reduce. Take things that are getting in the way of your own natural vitality, reduce them, let them go. You will be doing yourself a huge favor. Now, we are now at the very last line, which says, I have no desires, and the people simplify themselves. To say I have no desires and people simplify themselves, that's actually a straightforward, verbatim, literal translation, and it can very easily be misunderstood because, how can anyone have no desires? At least you have to desire to live. So I want to explain that having no desires in this context has a very specific meaning. What it actually says is that I have no excessive desires. I have no desires beyond that which I need to live well. Having no desires means managing excessive desires. And this is distinct from basic needs in life. Those are requirements. Those are not excessive desires. Wise rulers for the kingdom or the empire will focus on the basics. And what that means is that they will be watching out for their own excessive desires to not let them get out of control. And those excessive desires can include things like overly ambitious expansion that feeds the ego of the monarch. It can be the conquest of neighboring kingdoms, which can also feed the ego, the construction of grand, luxurious palace, etc. These are all things that can feed the ruling ego. So these are the things to be watched out for. When the ruler is able to do that, focusing on the basics, it motivates the people to also do the same thing, simplify themselves. They have a highly visible example to follow. And you can now probably see that this can apply to yourself, to life, very easily. When we apply to life, it just means that, like the wise ruler, you know the difference between what you need and what you want or would like to have. When you have clarity on this, you can manage effectively. When you are seeing clearly that there are certain things that you are desiring that are excessively out of your basic requirements of life, you can manage that. You can do a little bit of it, keep life interesting, but then realize that there's going to be times when you want to just let them go. This is what leads to the Tao of contentment. And it will naturally lead to that. There's no effort required for you to transform that to contentment. You will just be naturally content because you know what you need versus what you want. The hoarding and the accumulation will stop by themselves. Also naturally, you don't need to force yourself to discard clutter. You will be doing it as a matter of course. So now that we have seen these four things, these four lines from the sage, the sage says, I take on attached action, I prefer quiet, I do not interfere, I have no desire, etc., meaning excessive desires. These form the four pillars of what to do, as opposed to what to watch out for, what not to do. And that means we can use the similar graphic, but this time, this is the complementary duality, the other half of the yin and yang symbol. This is what to do. So for this particular slide, this is all about ruling the kingdom with upright integrity, which is from the very beginning of this chapter, line 1. Upright integrity, meaning openness, transparency, using Tao principles to rule the kingdom, starting with taking unattached actions. This is actually the Wu Wei that you have heard. It doesn't mean non-action. It doesn't mean doing nothing. Those are very inaccurate misinterpretations. Wu Wei in this context is to let go of attachments when you are acting to doing something required by the kingdom. So it means a reduction of complexity. It means doing away with the things that don't need to be done. So these are all part of the mindset of the ruler. It leads to the people transforming themselves. They follow the great example set by the ruler. Then the second thing, the second item is prefer silence, quiet. And as we have seen, this is what motivates people to set themselves upright. And we have also talked about how the peace and quiet, the tranquility and clarity, that's what connects you to the Tao. There's also the non-interference. So this is what leads to the people enriching themselves. At the level of the kingdom, it means the ruler refrains from intruding into people's lives. And last one is no excessive desires, leading to the people simplify themselves. And this is because when the ruler is focusing on the basics, the people will emulate that, and everything becomes much more simple, much easier. So we would turn around and look at all these four things and say, well, what can we do in life that reflects upon the advice from Lao Tzu, that we should also be acting without attachments. We should also be reducing complexity in our lives. Then various aspects of our lives will transform themselves. Silence, quietude, we would also want to establish some kind of quiet reflection as a daily practice so that we can be in touch with ourselves and in touch with the Tao. No interference. We want to focus on our own business and not get into other people's business because, my goodness, there's plenty that we need to do for ourselves. There's so much more to do. Once you learn and understand the Tao, there's literally no time to waste on other people's business. And lastly, no excessive desires. Simplify. This is contentment. All about contentment. So this is the four things to do, four things that are beneficial, applied to the kingdom and also at the personal level. It brings us to the very end of chapter 57. Let's talk about the paraphrase for 57. So what we want to do is to paraphrase the original with modern language to showcase understanding. So in section 1, Lao Tzu starts out talking about the right way to go about things, to govern a country, to deploy the military, to take the world. And remember, taking the world, in which case, is similar to our expression, winning the world, to be able to attain what we want, what we have set up as a goal. So here's the paraphrase for that. Wise kings of ancient times ruled with integrity, commanded the military with ingenuity, and took the world through non-interference. Like them, we should manage life with honor, accomplish objectives with creativity, and win the world without interfering with others. Then in section 2, Lao Tzu starts out asking himself, how do I know this is the case? Well, with the following. Then he talks about what not to do. Hence, the paraphrase that we can do will be the following. How do I know this is the right way? I know through my observations. When I study history, I see that the more restrictions there are, the more impoverished people become. The more weapons people have, the more likely they are to use them and create chaos in society. In general, the more complex things become, the more we see shrewdness, deception, and strange problems. Perhaps that is why the more laws we have, the more crimes occur. not the other way around. It's no different at the personal level. When I observe individuals, I see self-imposed limitations squeezing all the richness out of everything, resulting in an impoverished life. The more we attack others, the more we create chaos for ourselves. The more we resort to shortcuts, the more we waste time getting nowhere. In general, whenever we make things complicated, we rob ourselves of happiness and peace of mind. So I think, whenever we look at the paraphrase, one thing becomes clear, and that is the original may seem difficult to understand, but once it is paraphrased with modern language, the message from Lao Tzu becomes amplified and much easier to understand. So the last section is what we just went through. It's about what the sages have advocated as what to do, as opposed to what not to do. So here's the paraphrase for that. The sages have said, when rulers take unattached actions, talk less and do more, refrain from interference, and restrain their excessive desires, the people will transform, correct, enrich, and simplify themselves. We can learn from this and let go of attachments, connect with the Tao through silence, stop meddling, and moderate our own desires. This is the path for us to take the world, just as it was for the ancient rulers. Of course, the ancient rulers taking the world, that meant to establish empire across the ancient land of China. For us, taking the world, our little corner of the world would be being able to accomplish what we want to do in this world. So that was the paraphrase for 57. The very last thing that we need to do, that we should do, is to have a full circle discussion that links the very last part of this chapter to the very beginning. And when we connect them like this, we can really get the essence of the Tao. So here's how it looks. So we have the very last line of Tao Te Ching 57. As you can see in the lower right-hand corner of the slide, what it says is that these are the words of Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu says, if the ruler can be without excessive desires, then people will simplify themselves. So that's the last line. So what if we connect it back to the beginning? The beginning, the very first line is talking about using upright integrity to govern the country, to rule the kingdom. Then, of course, full circle discussion, we bring it back down to the last line again. Now, when we connect them like this, it gives us an additional insight. In order to rule the right way, first line, one must manage excessive desires, last line. One must simplify. So this is useful because it points to the one thing we must do to get started with this entire process, to practice the Tao as outlined in this chapter. It's the key for us in living our lives. Everything depends on the mastery of contentment. That is, managing excessive desires, simplifying everything, understanding what you need versus what you want. Everything starts there, the mastery of contentment. That's how you can rule your own life with upright integrity, producing all kinds of benefits. So the very last thing is the highlighting of the two characters, 治国, rule the kingdom, that best represents this entire chapter. So we're done with our discussion of 57, but I want to let everybody know this is hardly the end of this particular topic. The reason is because for generations, students of Tao have long noted the similarities between 57 and 58. In fact, 58 is a continuation. It's like the sequel. It's like a part 2, whereas 57 is the first one, part 1. When we go into 58, we're going to see a very clear delineation, continuation of the train of thought that Lao Tzu started in 57. So previously, for part 1 of Tao Te Ching, and again, we're talking about that yin and yang duality now, the 4 things to watch in life, these are the things that you don't want. You don't want to limit yourself. You don't want to arm yourself with weapons against other people, like criticism. You don't want to be shrewd in taking shortcuts because you're just going to cause problems for yourself, and you don't want too many rules to rob yourself of peace and happiness. That was from before. That was part 1. Today, part 2 are not the 4 things to watch out for in life, the 4 things to avoid, but rather the 4 things that are good, the what to do. Effective ways to rule your private kingdom. So that's what we talked about today in the first half of our meeting. What are the 4 ways? Well, unattached actions, 无为. When you take unattached actions, the results will take care of themselves. Now I know people are going to ask, well, how do you know that you are supposed to translate 无为 as unattached actions? 无 means to not have any, 为 means to do. So wouldn't that be just non-action? Well, that's a very popular mistranslation, very common misinterpretation. What's going on is that the vast majority of translators working in this field, in the Tao Te Ching, they themselves, most of them, do not know the original language. They don't know modern Mandarin. They certainly don't know ancient or classical Chinese. So they can only translate as the characters dictate. So for those exceptions, such as myself, who do have that ability, in my case, not just modern Mandarin, but also ancient classical Chinese, an entire world opens up that is not accessible to the vast majority of Western readership and writers. That world talks about commentaries and insights about Wu Wei. They are unified in pointing out that Wu Wei never has meant non-action, never has meant doing nothing, has always meant unattached action. Unattached action, the scope of that can be broad. It can be minimal action. I just have to nudge. Just have to nudge it a little bit in order for something good to occur. And I'm not doing more than I should. If I did, that would be attachments. Unattached actions can also include no action, but it doesn't mean no action by itself. It just means unattached. If I observe a situation, it's already headed in the right direction. I don't have any attachments to show off, to show everybody what I can do. So I kick back and I observe. I let the manifestation go to its natural conclusion. That's no action, but it's Wu Wei. It's unattached action. So I hope there's no confusion on this. It's very easy to confuse because most of the books, probably all other books, are going to be talking a lot about non-action. But that's just a part, that's just one part of the overall concept. Very important. Then we have preference for quiet. Hao Jing. What does that mean? Well, Silence facilitates your connection with the Tao. So if you don't have a meditative practice, I would encourage you to look into it. You don't need to practice transcendental meditation. It can just be some time set aside for you to be alone with your thoughts. Very beneficial. And then we have refrain from interference, non-interference. And that's because, frankly, you have more than enough problems of your own. Then, lastly, no excessive desires. That's just contentment. So that's what to cultivate. These are the 4 things in the second half of 57 that we talked about. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.